Welcome to a special edition of the Social Workers Radio Talk Show. I'll be your host today, Alyssa Lotmore, and I'm here today with Michael Wacholder, who worked at the prestigious RPI Institute for 40 years. There he served as an educator and developed Tech Park and the Incubator Program. However, today he's here to talk about his book titled, Where's There? The Shared Insights of a Stroke Survivor. Before I bring Michael in, I want to read an excerpt from from his book. And it says, "What's happening to me? I couldn't stand up without falling down. The left side of my mouth was drooped, and I was slurring my words. If I stuck out my tongue, it was curved to the left. I was bewildered, and yet still arrogant enough to deny these obvious symptoms and think that I would soon be discharged from the emergency room and return home. But it took 4 months before I went home, during which time I went from the ER to the OR to the ICU to a regular room in the hospital to an acute rehabilitation hospital to a subacute rehabilitation facility. I had a stroke, and this begins my story." Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and sharing some of my story with you.
Thank you so much. So I just want to start off with what inspired you to write this book. It's really a personal story, and what made you...
Well, before I even answer that, I want to comment on your first comment. Mm-hmm. You just described in reading that paragraph some of the symptoms of stroke. And if your listeners and your students learn anything from this interview, the most important thing is what are symptoms of stroke. And I'll come back to that probably as we talk about it. But that describes, the slurred speech, the crooked tongue, the weakness on one side or the other. Those are stroke symptoms, and all of us should be aware of it. I wish I were. I would have been able to have been, helped much sooner. But anyway, and that leads me to answer your question. Because when I had my stroke, I just had no idea what the hell was going on. I was naive and I was arrogant, thinking I never get sick. I can't get sick, so I'll get over this. But and along the way of all those months of recovery, and now 3 years since then, I've learned a lot. And my main motivation for writing this book has been to share what I learned and to share some of my original naivete that has turned into knowledge so that I could help other people. So many of us stroke survivors don't know what's going on or we're bewildered by the whole process. And so I'm hoping I'm able to share my bewilderment and my process, which most readers will find it's very similar to theirs. So let me tell you a quick story as to what prompted me to write the book originally. One day I was at therapy, and we were sitting around a table. It happened to be speech therapy that day. And my speech therapist was there, and a young lady from one of the local colleges who was studying speech therapy and was at the therapy center as an intern, as an intern. And I'm always fascinated by young students, and I'm a teacher and have been teaching college for years. So I asked her, I said, "What have you learned from this internship that you haven't learned or you had not learned in your classroom or in your textbooks?" And she, I think she enjoyed the question, and I was trying to get out of her the value of the internship and the value of being in a therapy environment. And as we talked, typical of me, I talked more and more, and she talked less and less, and I was sharing with her some of my insights about having been, a patient. And my therapist was there, and then suddenly there was another therapist at the table, and then another therapist. And I was drawing a small audience to my talk about the perspective of a patient. And finally I realized that I was monopolizing the discussion, and I was getting a little embarrassed by it. So I stopped and I said, "Excuse me, but, I'm monopolizing this conversation, and I hope I'm not boring you, or I'll shut up and let others talk." And they all said, no, please keep going. And one of the therapists said, "We never hear from the patient's point of view. We never hear that. You're sharing it. Please keep going." And so I kept going. And it was a delightful conversation. And then at the end of it, another one of the therapists said, "You should write a book." And I said, "Why?" And again she said, "Because we never hear the patient's point of view, and it's so unique and it's so helpful." And that planted a seed in my head about writing a book. And it was planted, but it wasn't nurtured. And then about a week later, I was at a different therapy center where I do hand therapy, because my stroke left me fairly well dysfunctional on the left side. My left leg, my left arm, etc., and the left side of my mouth for even speech. Luckily, my brain remained reasonably intact. Anyway, I was at the hand therapy center, and this was several months after maybe even a year after my stroke. And we were doing a very strenuous exercise by a wonderful guy who was the therapist. And I was really straining to do this thing. And as most therapists do, they're so supportive, and they're so, they always urge you on and support you. And he kept saying, "You're almost there, you're almost there, keep going, you're almost there." So I tried to move my arm from one position to another. And I was laying on my back with my arm up in the air doing that exercise. And it made, all of a sudden it just hit me, and I looked up at him and I said, "Where's there?" Because I was reflecting on how many there's I had traveled to in the last several months of recovery. There's always a milestone in front of you, whether it's starting to walk, your first step, you're starting to speak more clearly. You're always getting there. Somewhere you're getting there, and that's the theme of the book. Everything I write about is getting there. And so I thought, and after I said, "Where's there?" it struck me that what a wonderful title for my book, because if you've had a stroke, it's all about there, getting there. And I said to him, "Hey, I'm going to write a book, and that's going to be the title." And I'm a guy who can rally around special words. And once I had the incentive from the therapist about writing a book, and then it just struck me with a title. I knew it was a good title and a catchy title. I said, "That's it. I'm going to go home and write a book." And that's what I did.
I mean, that's just a wonderful story, how it sort of led to this. And it seems like the staff at the hospital were interested in hearing your story. It must have been helpful for you, I mean, I'm assuming, to write this book and sort of get all of these feelings out and emotions. And then it's also helpful for other people who might not know these warning signs, so it's informative as well. So who was your goal audience when you were writing this book? What was who did you hope that this would reach the most?
Well, it's certainly not a novel. It specifically targets an audience, which is composed of three parts. One, the stroke survivor. And I've passed this book on to several people I've met in therapy and elsewhere who have had a stroke. Some doctors, all kinds of people. And they have found it very comforting and very, it's very helpful to realize what you've been through is whatever most of us have been through. But anyway, my main audience is stroke survivors. But a second audience are families of stroke survivors. I realized that my family was very uninformed about stroke and what it meant and about recovery. And, you meet with the hospital, you meet with the social workers, you meet with everybody, but you're bewildered whether you're a patient or whether you're a family member. So I really felt family members, I wanted to reach out to them and help them. Thirdly, I want to talk to, through the book, caregivers, nurses' aides, anyone who gives care to the stroke patient, and therapists as well. And several therapists have read the book, and they also very favorably comment that it gives them insights about the patient and about what they could be doing. So that's all I want to talk to through this book: the patient, the family, the caregiver. That's my audience.
That's really, it's really, I'm so glad that somebody sort of takes this step to do this. I mean, you were going through a lot, and you could have sort of shut everything else out and not have been a resource, really, and that's what this book is, a resource to people. And yet you chose to sort of take this extra step to write a book and to get this message out there, which is a valuable message. So I do thank you for that. I am from the School of Social Work, so I would sort of like to know about your experience with social workers during this time. How was that for you?
Well, all the facilities I've been in, and that is several, from hospitals to acute care to subacute care, everybody has a social worker. And fundamentally, I think the job of the social worker is essential and very helpful. I have met good ones and I've met not so good ones. Some have frustrated me no end, and some have pleased me so much that I just was overwhelmed with how kind and helpful and knowledgeable and supportive they were. So fundamentally, the role of the social worker at these facilities is to assist the patient, to help the patient and the patient's family understand the process of recovery, of therapy, and then of transition to home or transition to another facility. And the social workers have always been helpful in identifying facilities and working with the patient to pick the best one. So in the context of very favorable comments, I will add a couple of less than favorable comments as well. Some social workers at some facilities, I have found, do nothing more than implement the institutional policy of the facility. And oftentimes that's simply stated, and not very nicely stated, but it's my words, not theirs, to get rid of the patient, to move them on. And that's very frustrating to the patient and to the well-being of the patient and to the patient's family. And when you confront that, it's like a war zone. And I had my struggles on occasion. Luckily, I had some tremendous advocates from my family, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about advocacy in a minute. I'm losing my train of thought here for a moment.
Sorry, take a second to regroup. So, so it seems like there was social workers who were helpful to you, but that at the same time, social workers in maybe that type of setting had sort of an agenda, should I say, you had to be moved along. There was a certain amount of time that you were supposed to be in there, and it's sort of trying to keep to that, which can be frustrating, especially when you might feel that you need a little extra time, or you don't want to be rushed, or you really want to have that time to process with somebody what's going on.
And those social workers that sat down with me and sat down with my family and that talked to us and that related to us were wonderful. But I lost my train of thought, I think, because God was punishing me because I was saying something not so nice. But let me return to that. I did have my moments with a few social workers, but luckily I'm an outspoken, obnoxious guy, and I would tell them how I felt. And so would my family. But also, there was an instance once of a person at the facility who I befriended, and we became very close. And this person had no support, no advocacy, and sort of I stepped in as her advocate, and so did my family. And we went to war with the social worker. And I'm going to only end this conversation by saying we won. We got this wonderful young woman to a facility where she could really be properly cared for, instead of being dumped in a facility that would not have done as well for her. So, but in spite of what I'm saying, the role of the social worker is essential and is helpful and is supportive and is of necessity.
And that's really good to hear. Like I said, coming from a lot of students who might listen to this piece, who there's a lot of interest in medical social work, and sort of how do you balance that with maybe pressure to continue with the discharge planning or whatever the responsibilities are, with still finding that need to meet the patient where they are, and see how do we give the patient what they need.
Critical word you said, discharge planning. That is frightening. Mm-hmm. And the social workers that understand not just the discharge process, but how frightening it is to the patient are those who are really helpful. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would like sometime, I'll plant the seed with you, Alyssa, to come and lecture your students about my book and about its content and about my perspective on social work and what these students can do when they get into the profession, helping people.
I will definitely be sharing that. And you spoke a lot in your book about advocates. A number of occasions you spoke about advocates. And why did you mention that I know you spoke about how you advocated for the woman in the facility with you, but why did you mention that so much? Was it something that seems to be something that stood out to you?
Because most of us don't have advocates, and every patient needs advocacy. And most patients don't have it, whether it's their family or whether it's their medical practitioners or whether it's friends. You're kind of there alone, most patients. And many patients have no resources, really, don't have any money, don't have those friends, or don't have a doctor in the family. So let me first tell you my story, and we'll extend it into this message. I was really lucky. I wasn't lucky to have a stroke, and I wasn't lucky how severe it was. But I was lucky because I have a twin brother, and he's a very accomplished physician. He lives far away. He lives in California, but he wasted no time in getting to his brother's side, coming to New York to be with me in this time of crisis, and then becoming my advocate, interacting with the doctors and nursing staff, especially when that first 2 critical weeks when I was in the hospital and when I had surgery. And he helped talk to the doctors, he helped plan the surgery, helped define and identify and talk one of the best surgeons into doing the job. So how lucky can you be to have a brother, who's a doctor in the family advocating for you? On top of that, he was very helpful to my wife and my children and my family, the rest of my family, in terms of what I was going through. So on the one hand, I had medical advocacy. And he's like me in a way. My wife always said, we're not identical twins. We don't look at all alike. He's tall and handsome, and I'm shorter and less handsome, and all these things. But my wife always said that we're identical twins when it comes to both of us being so obnoxious and opinionated. We do not withhold our thoughts about things. And he was helpful in that regard. Secondly, besides a medical advocate, I have a daughter who is a very accomplished lawyer in Albany, locally, and she was incredibly helpful from a legal perspective, just the way her mind works, and the way she analyzed the insurance industry and the way it worked, and the way hospital policies work. And so suddenly I had a perfect team, a lawyer and a doctor, advocating for me, especially when we confronted the social worker, or not really the social worker as much as the hospital or the facility, when they're trying to get rid of me, trying to get me out of the facility when I had really not accomplished enough to be on my own or to be elsewhere. And so my daughter, the lawyer, my brother, the doctor, were there being enormously helpful. Thirdly, though, I can't not mention the third factor of this, and that's my wife. And my wife stepped in when it came to arguments about insurance coverage. And everything's about insurance. And there's a lot of secrets about insurance, and I don't understand the secrets, but certainly the facilities do, and the workers there do. But I was lucky. As Alyssa said, I spent 40 years at RPI, and I had just retired. Actually, I had announced my retirement, but hadn't retired at the time of my stroke, and I retired 2 months into my stroke. And certainly I wasn't able to go back to work. But I had very good insurance coverage through RPI as a retiree. And my wife stepped in when it came to arguments about, well, you don't have enough insurance coverage, which is frequently the case with so many patients. I had good coverage. I was lucky. And my wife was a powerful advocate in terms of filling in that one last void about whether I did or didn't have good insurance coverage for hospitalization, for therapy, for all the attention I needed as a stroke survivor. So I had an advocacy team. It was wonderful. And now I preach all the time, and I hope there's ways I can find that we can bring advocacy to patients in hospitals. Personally and selfishly, I want to bring advocacy to stroke patients. And I've talked to my daughter, the lawyer, about it. She gives up a lot of her free time for pro bono work with battered families, battered women, abused women and children. And I've suggested to her she ought to shift some of her focus, even though that focus is incredible and she's gotten rewards for it, but maybe encourage some of her colleagues to form an advocacy team that could step into facilities and advocate for patients. Now, the other thing I'm going to keep going. The other aspect of it, I think the social worker is potentially an incredible advocate for the patient. It's a delicate line they have to walk, because they're walking between advocating for the patient, if they do it, and advocating or implementing house policy. But what better definition of social work, when you think about those two words, is there than advocating for the person in need? And I really assign that to two factors at these facilities. One, the social worker, and two, the hospitalist. The hospitalist is a peculiar concept that I don't yet fully understand. But I do understand my own definition of a hospitalist, which should be, in my opinion, an advocate for the patient, especially an advocate in terms of bringing together all the separate disciplines a patient requires, someone looking at the whole picture, but also someone representing the patient and helping the patient make decisions. Now, hospitalists will run right out of the room if I said that. Oh, I can't make decisions for the patient. And the hospitalist is probably correct. But the hospitalist can certainly guide the patient and help inform the patient so the patient can make an informed decision. And so between the social worker and the hospitalist at facilities, that's the core of an advocacy team when they don't have the benefit of family members and friends who can step in and play the role.
Well, it seems like you had a wonderful support system, and as you said, not many people do have that type of team that's already in place for them. So the need to have something like this, more people, like I said, volunteer doing like pro bono work as lawyers, or more people, social workers, knowing what the patients do need. I think it's something that's beneficial for them to know in advance, so they know what resources are out there for them. They might just have to ask for them, or how do we reach them?
Let me add one more thing. Ultimately, the ultimate advocate is the patient. Most of us, though, and even me, as obnoxious as I can be, most of us are so bewildered and so uninformed about what we're going through, it's hard to sit there or lay there in your bed and assess your circumstances, especially if you're, almost 100% immobilized. But I will, one of my messages to patients is be your own advocate. Speak up, ask questions, and don't be satisfied with an answer until you understand it.
Yeah.
So I want to encourage patients to be their own advocate and to be forceful in their advocacy. I can remember I really annoyed some nurses because I insisted on knowing what pills they were giving me. And some of the nurses didn't think I had the right to ask. And that only just infuriated me. But I was hated by that particular nurse, for a long time, because I was obnoxious enough to say, tell me what pills I'm taking, and I wanted to keep track of that.
And that's important, just from, I've been in the hospital for little things, but it's, when you do ask, sometimes it depends on the response. Sometimes you'll get a response of more of that frustrated, well, I'm just telling you to do this. This is what you need to do, versus other people who really explain it and say, okay, let's be a part of this process. This is something, here's what you need to take. So it does make a difference, that whole type of presentation from the staff at the hospital as to how that patient really feels. And do they have a say in the recovery? Do they know what's going on in the recovery? Or are they just being sort of told, do this and don't ask questions?
And back to the social worker. The social worker, in many respects, can fulfill that role without compromising their duties to their employer or to their profession. The social worker can help the patient understand the role of advocacy and understand their particular need for advocacy. And it can maybe make them feel confident enough to become their own advocate. Remind me when I come and talk to your students, I want to talk about that. How to I want to really lecture those students about teaching patients to become advocates.
That's a valuable tool. That's a valuable tool.
But I'm monopolizing too much of the talk, so
no,
get to your questions.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting, and it's very useful. A lot what you're saying, it gives that perspective that a lot of times we don't think about. When we think about stroke, we usually think medical in terms of the medical terminologies and things that have to do with doctors, but we really sometimes forget all the other issues that can arise in terms of how the person is feeling, how do they feel about the recovery, the stresses of the families, the caregivers, and I think that's something that your book brings in and brings light to those other aspects. I know in your book you include the blog postings that your daughter, is that the same lawyer? Which daughter is that?
Different daughter.
Yes, you share blog postings. Yeah, can you please share about the blogs and why you chose to incorporate that?
Well, when I became ill with the stroke, I hate even saying ill, I don't know if it's the right term, but when I had the stroke, I have a daughter locally, the lawyer, and I have a daughter in Lake Placid who's very creative in all forms, writing, art, skating, athletics, just a very creative girl. And she was really touched by what I had been through and knew that I had so many friends and family members who wanted to stay abreast of what's going on with her dad. So she started a blog. And almost every night for a while she would write in her blog because we talked on the phone every day. And once a week she would drive down from Placid and visit me for a day or two. And the blog became an instrument of communication for friends and family wanting to know on an ongoing basis how I was doing. And it was really wonderful for me, by the way, just reading it. She's such a beautiful writer. And as I reread her blog entries, it occurred to me that there's really two authors of this book. One is me and sharing my perspective, my experiences, my insights, and one was hers, the perspective of a loving family member going through the whole process of dealing with stroke of a family member. And so I wanted to tell two stories at one time. I thought it would add to the value to the reader, and it shares a perspective that most readers don't have. So on the one hand, the reader is hearing from a family member that story, and on the other hand, they're hearing my story. And the other thing her blog added to it was it added a sequential element to the book. In other words, her blog was day 1, day 2, day 3, week 1, week 5, week 6, etc. So you could follow my recovery through her blog, and I would wander a lot, but often concentrating on things she wrote in the blog. But so there's also a sequential element to the book through her blog. And many people have written me who have read the book have said, my God, that girl can write. She's wonderful. And I know she can write. So it added something to the book, and I think it added huge value to the book, not just in the pleasure of reading nicely constructed sentences, but also in reading about this unfortunate thing that so many people have suffered from in terms of stroke.
But there's so many different, like how we talked about at the beginning, there's so many different aspects. It's the person who's had the stroke, person who's recovering, and then the family member. And like I said, that bringing that together in such a beautiful way was very informative, and it had that gave that personal touch that is needed when you're reading. So I think it fit well. Mm-hmm.
You keep giving me thoughts with everything you say. I do believe her writing the book was a great way for her to deal with her dad's stroke. I mean, not the writing the book, writing the blog. It was therapeutic for her to write it. It just allowed her to get things off her mind and share it, and it gave her comfort, it made her feel good. Also, you had asked earlier about my motivation for writing the book, and I shared it with you, but there was another real benefit of writing the book, and that was my own therapy, personally therapeutic. To be able to sit down and just reflect. And when I would write a section of the book, I would feel so good because I shared something, I got it off my mind. It was great therapy. And now I'm thinking a lot about the next book I might want to write, for stroke survivors. And that I'll talk about that in a little bit if we have time. But the whole thought about that book is called What's Next, which is the way I ended this book, by talking about what's next for us stroke survivors, because we're never going to be able to return to what we were. We have to figure out what we can become. And that's what's next. And maybe one of my what's next is to become an author, which I've already started, and I've proven to myself that it's therapeutic. Now I'd like to prove that I can reach out through that book and help people. I'm not trying to make money. I'm not trying to do anything but reach out and share the book with people that could benefit. Sorry for another long answer. Go ahead. Next question.
They're very eloquent answers, and they have a lot of meaning. Everything you're saying it really hits for the listener. As myself, I'm sitting here, and you've accomplished so much, and you took a situation and a circumstance that was not very favorable with the stroke, and you've sort of transformed it in putting this new meaning to what you want to do, and that's very inspiring. I want to shift a little bit to part 2 of your book, where you discuss the recovery mantras and what meaning do they have.
Well, reflecting on my earlier story about how I was motivated when I came up with the title of the book, Where's There, I've always rallied around interesting words or interesting phrases. And one thing I noticed as I was recovering, that there were certain things that was happening to me, and I could sum them up in 1 or 2 words, which I realized were becoming my mantras. Mm-hmm. And so before I start with what the mantras are, I want to share with you a description by Deepak Chopra of a mantra. I love this, and I got this from reading about him. He said, Deepak Chopra said in an interview, he was discussing meditation mantras and presented the following definition of mantra. The first syllable of the word means mind, and the second syllable means instrument, which means a mantra is an instrument of the mind, used to get to a destination. So what follows are my mantras that guide me, that remind me, that challenge me, and that motivated me as my journey continued. Now at home, but always navigating to keep progressing toward the desired destination. So I kind of rally around these words. So let me share with you, I have about 6 or 7 mantras, so I'm not going to try and monopolize too much discussion, but I'm going to share each one because each one's critical. And so many people have written back to me and said, I love this one, I love that one's really helping me. And even my sister, who's dealing with getting back into exercising and trying to improve her health, called me recently. She said she had read about one of the mantras, which was the first one I would talk about, patience and persistence, the extent to which those 2 words are guiding her. So anyway, here are my mantras. Number 1 is patience and persistence. Number 2 is strength and balance. Number 3 is cognition and confidence. Number 4 is think, think, think. Number 5 is resist, resistance. And number 6 is determination and discipline. So let me go back to the beginning. Patience and persistence. In this business of stroke recovery, it's all about being patient and being persistent. By being patient, I mean it takes a long, long time to recover. And the recovery is measured in millimeters, measured in such small increments that you can hardly recognize them. So once you figure that out, you've got to learn to be patient about looking back and collectively adding those millimeters together. And you got to be persistent and never giving up, because over time they do add up to recognizable gains. So patience and persistence are a mantra that I remind myself about every day. And when I get up every morning and I go to another room in my house and I start my morning exercises, it's all about being persistent and knowing each day as they add up, I'll get somewhere with these exercises. So that's enough of that for now. The second one is strength and balance. For those of us who suffered a stroke, and I shouldn't restrict it only to strokes, but it helps anybody, whether you have a cancerous condition or brain injury or whatever it might be. Strength and balance are two things you can't get along without. You can't recover without building up your strength and establishing your balance. And I can't tell you how long I worked at that and how I continue to work at that, both strength on the one hand and balancing on the other. Because if I'm going to learn to walk well again, I got to have good balance, and I got to rebuild the strength on my affected side, and I got to build the strength on my unaffected side. So I used to, when I was in a rehab facility, I used to sneak into the gym. They always got mad at me, but that was too bad for them. And I would get on their exercise machines and work on my right arm, my good arm, with weights and things, because I knew that my right arm would be carrying me. It would be the arm I would be leaning on, and it needed to be strong. And my left arm, my affected arm, would never have the strength my right arm had and then would continue to get. So if we were on TV, I'd show off by showing you my muscles on my right arm side. But nevertheless, strength and balance are essential ingredients. And every day I do my exercises, some are devoted to balance, and some and most are devoted to strength. So, critical mantra. 3, cognition and confidence. Cognition is basically knowledge. And those of us who have had a stroke have got to increase our knowledge about things and about what it takes to be recovering, to recover. And once we become knowledgeable, we become confident. And once we become confident, we're able to do things. And there's a thing in the book that I write about when an aide who's been helping me for now 2 or 3 years, we were outside walking, I was walking with a cane, and she was distracted by doing something else. So I just got up and started walking away with my cane. And I finally got parcel down my driveway, and I turned back to see if she was even there, and there she was, but standing there, not coming to support me. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm watching you." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you're walking so well, what I'm watching is your confidence. You are now confident, and that's why you're able to walk so well." Now, mind you, I was with a cane and all kinds of stuff. But that's why there's a mantra about this whole concept of cognition and confidence. Once I knew what it took to be able to walk with a cane, how to get those movements, once I had the strength in my arm to hold on to the cane, once I had the balance to take the steps, that's all knowledge-based. And once you have the knowledge base, you have the confidence. Once you have the confidence, you can do what you never thought you could do. So cognition leads to confidence. Confidence leads to success. My 4th mantra is think, think, think. And that's one of my favorites because it's so silly. There's a whole paragraph in my book that only uses the word think. And people read it think I'm nuts, but it just says think, 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 think. And once in a while I add another word like ideate or solve or whatever. And my message there is you can't solve a problem without thinking about it. Thinking and thinking and thinking. And eventually you will think it through, and that will add to your confidence as well. And then you can implement your solution. And so think, think, think is so critical. It's just, I could tell you an incredible amount of stories. Let me tell you one quick one. Recently, my sister came from California to visit me, and she and I and her friend drove to Lake Placid to see the blogger. And the blogger, my daughter, got us a beautiful room, couple of rooms at this wonderful hotel, the Whiteface Lodge in Placid. And my room was a handicap accessible room. And I called my daughter and I said, "Look, I'm a little concerned about the room. And, I need to know things. I need knowledge. Could you take with your fancy cell phone now, which does everything, take a few pictures of the room, of the bed, of the bathroom, of the shower, of the toilet area, so I can see what it's like and where the grab bars are. And I can think about how I can get in and out of bed, because I've never been out anywhere but in my own room or in a hospital room." So in some respects, going on this adventure was nerve-wracking, and in many respects, I knew I could overcome whatever it was. But to have knowledge would be helpful, and to think about it would be helpful. So she sent me pictures, and by the time I got there, I had already thought through, even though the handicap bar was on the wrong side of the toilet for me. You know, I have been in enough public restrooms over the last couple of years that you're never going to get a perfect situation. So I learned how to adapt. And the handicap bar was really on the wrong side for me, but the sink was on the other side. And by looking at those photos, I figured out before I even got there what I could do and how I could use that bath, how I could use the toilet, how I could use the bathroom, how I could get in and out of bed. And so it's all about think, think, think. And when I designed this room that we're sitting in and designed the bathroom and the shower stall, the shower became a critical issue that I thought about for weeks and weeks about how big the shower should be, how to wheel into it, how to have the grab bars in the right place, how to have the bench in the right place in the shower, how to have the shower head in the right place where I can manipulate it and use it. It's all about think, think, think. So enough said about thinking. All of us need to think.
Well, it's a valuable element, and it also helps decrease anxiety. As you're going into new situations, like how you were going into the hotel, it could sort of take some of that initial anxiety of when you're going away. I already thought about this. I sort of know what to expect.
Exactly.
So it's definitely a useful tool for anyone to sort of think and have that knowledge beforehand.
I used to preach about. When I was a Cub Scout, we learned the mantra, or the motto was be prepared. And then I preached when I was in the profession about being prepared is so essential to your success. And now being prepared is so essential to my own success in dealing with my own challenges. So anyway, the last thing I want to tell you about in this mantra thing is, actually not quite the last, resist resistance. And that came out of a book I read. I'm struggling now to think of the title and the author. But what was it? It was about the art of, I can't quite recall the name of it, so we don't need the name. But it was an interesting book. But the author talked about how difficult it is for him to sit down and write. And I had the same problem. And I related that problem also to how difficult it is to force myself to get out of bed and go and do my exercises. And then I would observe in the therapy units I was in how difficult it was for so many patients to get to the therapy gym and start their therapy. They would have every excuse for not going. And what they were doing was resisting going. And we all have that. And this author wrote about how he would resist writing. And when he finally forced himself to write, he'd get going really well. And I found the same thing. I was quite lucky with this book. I couldn't wait to get to the next section of it. But with exercising and everything, I borrowed his concept about resistance, which is so fundamental to all of us. And I titled my mantra, Resist Resistance. Yep. Because when you know you're resisting something you should be doing, you've got to resist it. And you've got to get on with it. And you've got to overcome that mental thing. Mm-hmm. So that's my mantra, Resist Resistance. And then finally, there's one that's called Determination and Discipline. And I think I've already said enough about that. But determination is essential has been to me. I've got to be determined to recover, to improve, to get to the next there, there after there after there, to get there, to be determined, and to discipline myself to get there. So, anyway, those are my mantras.
And those are wonderful. And like how you said, they can be applied to someone beyond a stroke survivor. It can be applied to anyone sort of going through a life-changing event, and how you're not going to be the same person that you were, but how do you grow from that? And here are some, these mantras help you to get there. And like how it's appropriate, where is there, and then what next? So that leads us into what next. After you have these mantras, you've done what you need to do. What next for individuals?
I really think it's critical that we talk about that, and that we talk about it, within the stroke community. I belong to a stroke recovery group at St. Peter's. Actually, it's sponsored by Albany Med, though. And I talk about this to the group. What is next for us? We're not going to, as I said earlier, we're never going to become what we were. We have to figure out what we can be. And I read another great book that I quote in my book. It's called Transitions. And it's all about defining a new beginning when we go through a life-changing transition. And in my case, and stroke recovery case, we have to think about the new beginning, what we can become. And so I asked the question at the end of the book, what's next? And for me, I thought about volunteering, and many of my stroke friends think about the same thing. Volunteering, doing a lot of reading, writing, in my case, becoming an author. There's so many things that we can do and be helpful about doing. And I want to write a book that focuses on what's next for people who have survived a stroke and redefine their lives. And redefine their lives in a meaningful way. So that I want to profile the stories of other people in writing about what's next. So that's where I'm going to sort of leave this discussion and hopefully return someday with a what's next story. But before I do, can I add one more thing?
Yes, absolutely.
So if there's a final message that I hope any listener listens to and goes away with, I want to just briefly mention the symptoms of a stroke. So many of us don't understand them. Before I mention all the symptoms, remind you of them because we said it too earlier. Another quick story. My wife's sister was very aware through my wife and through me of my stroke and my symptoms of stroke. And one day she was in church and the priest was acting very peculiar. And it was completely he was out of his comfort zone. He was acting in a way that they weren't familiar with. And everyone was concerned, but no one knew what to do. And finally, my wife's sister stepped in and said, hey, look, this guy could be having a stroke. His behavior is not normal. He's demonstrating symptoms of stroke. He must get to a hospital immediately. And they did it, and they saved his life. He was having a stroke. And the whole issue with stroke is the sooner you can get to care, to emergency room, and the fundamental principle is to get there within 3 hours of the first symptoms of stroke, the higher the probability of it being corrected and not being severe. In my case, it was over 8 hours before I was really corrected, before I was under care, and a lot of damage had been done. But anyway, so what did she recognize? The 4 symptoms of stroke. And it's through, they use the word FAST, F-A-S-T. F stands for face. Does one side of the face droop or is it numb? Ask the person to smile. Is the person's smile uneven? So F in FAST is for face. A is for arm, and the arm is generally one arm and the other tends to be weak or numb. Ask the person to raise both arms. Does one arm drift downward? Fundamental symptom. So now we got F and A of FAST. S is speech. And typically, the speech of a stroke victim is slurred. And the person is unable to speak. Is the person unable to speak or hard to understand? Ask the person to repeat a simple sentence like the sky is blue. Is the sentence repeated correctly? And then T is time, call 911. If someone shows any of these symptoms, even if the symptoms go away, call 911. And get the person to the hospital immediately. And it's that 3-hour rule is so critical. So I hope everyone remembers FAST. And when you see someone with symptoms, don't hesitate. Because you could save a life or you could save years of discomfort and handicap. by getting someone there quickly.
And I liked how you said, even if the symptom goes away, to still go, because so many times people try to wait it out. Oh, and then if it goes away, we just say, oh, it was probably nothing, and then something more severe could happen.
And read my book, because that's the way I felt about me, arrogant me. There was nothing wrong with me. I was in a hurry to get to the hospital. So what a fool I was. What a fool. And now I won't allow anyone else to be as foolish as I was. And I wanted people to get informed and educated about it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me to discuss your book, for writing this book, because it really is well written. And it's just, as someone who wasn't even familiar with strokes, I found myself still pulled into this story. So you've reached an audience even outside of the one that you intended, because I think anyone can read this book and sort of feel that connection and feel your story, how your daughters, as a part of the blog, you can really relate to the individuals in this book, yourself and your daughter, and the experience that someone's going through, as well as informing us. So I do thank you for taking the time to meet with me to discuss this, and hopefully we'll meet again when you just write your next book. What did you say it's going to be called? What's Next? What's next? So I do look forward to that. So if anyone is interested, Michael's book is called Where's There? The Shared Insights of a Stroke Survivor, and I'm sure it's available on Amazon.com.
Actually, it's not yet available.
Not yet available.
And I'm exploring that.
Okay.
Because my goal is to reach as many people as possible, and I can't imagine a rehab center or a hospital not having a book like that. But also, I am hopeful that it's good enough that a publisher might pick it up and want to get it more broadly distributed, because that's my goal. Like I said, I'm not trying to make money. I'm trying to reach an audience. And if it's good enough to reach the audience, hopefully anyone listening to this show who might be connected to a publisher or to a publisher's agent could help me reach out to those people and figure out how to get this book more broadly published. So far, I've self-published it. And I've published about 100 copies. And I give them to therapists, I give them to doctors, I give them to patients in hopes that the word is spread. Now I'm talking to the self-publisher about how to get it on like Nook or iBooks, through Barnes & Noble. So hopefully we can reach a broader audience.
Well, it's a valuable book. Like I said, a personal story with a lot of information and knowledge for the reader. So hopefully it does get to that audience, because it was a really wonderful read. And
well, thank you for saying such kind words, and I appreciate this opportunity of being with you and chatting.
Right.
And I look forward to coming and telling the kids in class.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And again, this is a special edition of the Social Workers Radio Talk Show, where we are doing a pre-record with Michael Wacholder. So it's not live, but it is certainly a very valued show, and it will be available on YouTube as well as played live periodically throughout the year. So thank you again, and we hope you tune in to our next episode.